Good morning and welcome back to the Fastly YouTube channel for the 11th episode of Fastly Developers Live. Today we're going to take a step back from the world of compute, which we previously covered very heavily, and we're going to take a look at one of our security products, specifically taking advantage of our Web Application Firewall to streamline the process of documenting and securing web APIs. To talk about this, I'm pleased to welcome to today's stream Security Strategist Brooks Cunningham. Welcome to the stream, Brooks.
It's a pleasure to be here. And like Kalen just said, my name is Brooks Cunningham. I'm a security strategist here at Fastly, and it's a pleasure to talk about our security products here at Fastly. And so really what I want to focus on during this conversation is really just kind of an overview of the NextGen WAFF platform with Fastly. And also I'll dive into the OpenAPI spec and how you can utilize that to protect your traffic. Both you'll be able to generate an OpenAPI spec with a third-party tool called APIClarity, and then use that generated spec to actually protect your traffic.
Thanks, Brooks. Before we get started, I was under the impression that WAFs are usually a black box that ops teams deploy to shield applications, but I had never considered that as a developer I could take advantage of the data that it collects to help me with my job. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Absolutely. So within the NextGen WAFF, we do collect some logging information, and you can utilize that to help build out an OpenAPI spec. Now, for folks that aren't super aware of what an OpenAPI spec is, I'll go into it a little bit more in a moment, but just know for now that it's a means for documenting your APIs in a standardized way using the OpenAPI spec. Some other folks might have, some terminology that other folks might be familiar with is a Swagger file. But the more modern standardization is OpenAPI spec.
I'd actually never considered that a WAF could be helpful as a developer. So why don't we just go ahead and get right into it?
Absolutely. So just a quick overview of what is the Fastly NextGen WAF. It was formerly known as Signal Sciences. So you might see up here dashboard.signalsciences.net. Fastly acquired the company Signal Sciences, and the product is being rebranded as the Fastly NextGen WAF. So with that mentioned, there's two different views within the console here. There's a corp level overview, which gives you a high level perspective of all the traffic that we're inspecting from the WAF perspective. But what we're going to do is we're going to dive straight into the site summary. So if we were to look at some of the requests within here, I'm going to go to this pet store demo. I can see there's a handful of requests that have been sent. So this is a sampling of the requests that we're inspecting and analyzing. In this case, I can see that there's a number of requests for Pet Store 3, Swagger IO, API v3, user Alice. So there's lots of good information with the requested method, the domain, the URL, and some attributes that are associated with the request. One of the things that we're going to specifically look at is this API spec mismatch. So, but if we go into the request details here, we get a lot of really good information about that specific request, including request headers, the response information, response headers, and then we decorate requests with what we call signals. In other cases, it might be referred to as tags, but the terminology that we use within Fastly are signals when decorating the request with additional context and information that might be useful when inspecting requests and analyzing that traffic for anomalies or a retrospective analysis for the traffic you're seeing on the site. So let's get right to it with looking at some of the request rules that you can utilize. So there's a lot of other things that you can do within here, but the site rule that I have here is I want to take an action on requests that don't match up with an API spec. So I'll show you what this looks like in just a moment, but just know that I can easily go in here and enable and disable requests, or this request rule, to quickly block, or I can even take an action such as add additional intelligence, such as this add signal here. So let's go into the Swagger UI. So this is a way to visualize an OpenAPI spec. is a really popular tool, Pet Store Swagger IO, Pet Store 3 Swagger IO. And using this Swagger file, which is located here, in this case is just JSON, but you can look at the other format, including YAML, to see how that is exactly formatted. But I'm able to document my API using that schema file. And so for endpoints such as /user, post, you can really easily interact with this API using just that spec file. So there's a lot of benefits to having this documentation in this specific format. It can do a lot of really cool things. This is just one of the ideas as far as like building out a UI, but within tools APIs, tools.openapis.org, there's tons and tons of other reasons why you might want to do implementation of an OpenAPI spec, including building out the SDK to interact with your APIs as well. A popular case is if you don't have, for example, a JavaScript SDK or a Go SDK, you can use an OpenAPI spec to help you build out those SDKs rather than having to manually build them yourself. Kalen, any questions on what we've gone over so far?
No questions so far, but I do want to remind our viewers that there are links in the description to all of the mentioned resources, including an explainer of what OpenAPI is, as well as a link to Fastly's own API documentation, which we describe as OpenAPI, and we use that specification to generate documentation as well as API clients for multiple languages.
Well, thank you for that, Kalen. Moving on, so what if you don't have an OpenAPI spec like this? You haven't quite gone down that journey yet. Well, no problem. There's fantastic third-party tools such as APIClarity that you can utilize to help generate that spec for you, get you started down that path. And so that's what I'm going to show you today. So I've already spun up the APIClarity tool. And what it's going to do is I'm going to pull down requests that were sampled through that NextGen WAFF console. I'm going to send it to my locally running APIClarity environment, and then I'm going to construct my OpenAPI spec from that information that I'm sending to APIClarity running locally. So I'm just going to do this command, make demo, and if all goes well, a bunch of requests are going to be sent over to APIClarity. Fantastic, looks like there were. I'm then going to open this up in my browser. And now I can see a number of requests were sent to my locally running instance of APIClarity to help construct this Swagger file. So I'm going to click into here, click reconstructed, and then I want to see on Swagger. Actually, let's go back to that because I want to reset this and I want to construct it from scratch. So review, So I'm going to do that demo part one more time so that way y'all get to see it first. Make demo. This is super fast, by the way. Now I'm going to go back here. Reconstructed, and now I get a chance to review that reconstructed spec. So there's a lot of really good information within here, just as a place to kind of get started and give you an idea. But what's really cool about the APIClarity is that you can click into update attributes as well. So in this case, I know that I do have this API v3 user. It's what's used to create users, and it's a post. And then I also have this endpoint if I'm going to update a specific user, that I'm going to have multiple usernames, and that Alice is just a representation for a username. So let's type username. So this way, if there were other puts for other usernames, such as Bob, Charlie, Donald, Eric, whatever it might be, then it's going to be conforming to that API spec. So I'll review and approve. I want to use OpenAPI v3 and see on Swagger. So now I have that spec already generated with this information, at least for this these specific endpoints. So if I wanted to send additional traffic to APIClarity, it's super easy to help construct this spec even further. So how do I actually use this within the NextGen WAF? I have another instance here. I'm just going to take a quick look at my make file, make sure I'm referencing the right thing. So in this case, I want to utilize this OpenAPI spec here, and it's going to API v1 reconstructed, API v1 reconstructed, fantastic. And I want to run the command rerun exec API. Awesome. So make rerun exec API. And so now it's spinning up, make API demo. And what I want to do is I'm going to send a request for Bob, actually, and I'm going to make that a put. So this request, it's allowed through, it's not a block actually being returned back through the NextGen WAF because this is a valid request. But if I were to change this to a post, it'll get blocked. So I'm going to specify that here. As soon as I change the rule to block. So we do operate in a log-only mode initially. I didn't have the rule configured to block there. So I'm just going to click that rule here and have that one block action. Excellent. And so this will give you an idea of just how quickly some of the rule sets can propagate as well. So I have this locally running NextGen WAF instance, and I'm going to send a request through it that do not conform to that spec, and it's going to block the request that doesn't conform to the spec. So the rule sets that I'm configuring here are through dashboard.signalsciences.net, but it's actually going to propagate through the agents across my environment. So in this case, I have the agent running locally, but just as easily, I could be running on the Fastly Edge environment. I could be running on the on-prem infrastructure, whether it's Azure, GCP, AWS, really any infrastructure where we can deploy our agent. We get that configuration down to those agents so they can utilize this type of functionality for the rule set. So it should propagate here soon. We're going to double check. Fantastic. So now I can see I send that request. It's a post. It's not conforming to the spec. I can even see in the logs here that I'm posting out. Just do it again so it makes it a bit clearer. This API spec mismatch. So this signal is getting added and decorated with that request that we're going to push up to the console and get some visibility into this as well. So this is a super easy way that I can identify the requests that are not conforming to the spec and that I'm blocking. But if we go into the UI, and it does take about a minute or so for the request to get uploaded to the UI and to be visible within there. But I'll go ahead and click in some of the requests here. Past 15 minutes. Fantastic. So I can see here some of one of the requests that was blocked, in this case for Bob. And so if I go into the details pane here, and I can easily see, here's the request back in there. The signals that were added to the request, including this API spec mismatch, some details as far as why it's a mismatch. It's that in that post method. The post method is not defined for my OpenAPI spec. And then I can see even the rule that blocked the request. So if I click into there, here's that rule. So it's fantastic that we can see requests getting blocked here, but there may be a case where you want to utilize that OpenAPI spec in a very narrow way. So take, for example, there's a feature set that gets released into production that maybe is not accounted for within the OpenAPI spec, or you just want to be very narrowly focused on a specific endpoint. Let's take, for example, in this case, since we already have that user endpoint for creating users, maybe we want to only be very narrowly focused on having this positive security model on that user endpoint. So it's really easy to do that through the NextGen WAF. In this case here, I have this request rule where it's just applying across the entire site for this API spec mismatch. But all I have to do is I can say add condition, path, let's see, actually equals, and this is going to be API v3 users, and then method is post. So now I've created this rule, and it should be propagating here shortly. And so I'm going to go back here and see that we're not doing enforcement anymore on other paths, but we are doing enforcement on the post for that specific path. So if I send this request here, I'll just say /login even. Fantastic, that request is getting through. It does say 405, it's being allowed through to the origin. Checkout, fantastic. But the one that I'm most interested in is just doing a post here, and I want to make sure that I don't get blocked. Excellent, I don't get blocked. I do see a 404, but that's to be expected just from that endpoint. But if I was going to get blocked, then I would receive a 406 getting returned back. But that's the demo and how you can be very narrowly focused to specific paths to really potentially limit the blast radius from any type of positive security model changes.
I think it's also worth mentioning that when setting this up, there is no requirement that you block requests from the get-go. In fact, most customers like to run the WAF in what we call logging mode, which will log signals that are added to requests instead of taking action like blocking them right away. This allows you to deploy the WAF with confidence that it isn't impacting traffic, while you have a chance to review its decisions and make sure that your rules are up to scratch before blocking clients.
Absolutely. So that's one of the fantastic things about the product as well is, I mean, we want to first and foremost give you visibility and then leave it up to you as far as like what's your policy or stance towards taking an action on attack traffic and various types of abuse traffic and your risk threshold towards false positives. Certainly when it comes to things like rate limiting, which we also have available within request rules as well. But if you wanted to decorate requests with your own custom signals and then build logic on top of that, it's really easy to do that just by clicking that add signal and then clicking the drop down to add additional signals.
In the meantime, Brooks, I actually have my own question for you. My
Sure.
understanding of a firewall, as I mentioned earlier, is pretty much a black box model where it gets deployed in front of your production environment and it blocks requests based on its own understanding of what is valid or not. But this can be a bit worrying to me as a developer because I'm used to being able to test my applications in CI or on my own machine and see behavior that's consistent and possible to replicate. Is there a way that I could use the WAF as part of these workflows to test against how the application would behave in production?
Oh, fantastic question. So I love talking about CI/CD pipelines and talking about where the NextGen WAF can fit in within there. And honestly, there's a lot of different areas where it can. From a developer's perspective, I've worked with customers that want to embed our agent or deployment within their core image. So in this case, for like Nginx, they might want to deploy the agent onto that image along with a module there. So that way, as they're doing development locally, as the devs are doing the development, it's already just baked into that dev environment. And so they don't have to worry about, is the WAF is it working in their development environment and not, or is it working in production but not in development, or vice versa, or some behaviors there. It really helps the developers get used to working with a WAF much earlier in the process. And also it gives the security operations team visibility and understanding into the application ahead of a release. So for example, in this case, for an OpenAPI spec and working on it, you can help to generate that spec and that documentation that potentially could be utilized for production way ahead of it actually getting released into production. So by having a WAF that can be embedded into very, very early on into the developer lifecycle or that CI/CD pipeline, you're going to get things out to production faster and more safely as well.
That's really great to hear. I've never personally set up a WAF before, but this sounds pretty straightforward. And it sounds like it just comes as an app package, right? I just run a command to install it, then I can configure my API token, and it'll run on my machine just like it does in production.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's super easy to install. We have a variety of ways we can integrate, whether it's Kubernetes, easy Docker deployments. I mean, we can deploy onto Windows machines, Linux. We also have serverless deployments as well. And of course, our edge infrastructure supports the integration too. So we can easily deploy across really any environment, any infrastructure. If it's HTTP or HTTPS traffic that you want to protect, we can do it.
I'm definitely curious to know how many people are running modern web applications with a Windows firewall in front. I'm sure it's more than a few. Well, thank you for your time today, Brooks. It's been really fascinating to have this insight into a different part of the Fastly platform that I'm used to. And to our viewers, thank you all for joining us today. I really hope you learned something new. As I mentioned earlier, there are resources in the description of the stream, so go take a look, do some further reading, and get this set up and running for yourself. Brooks, is there anything you'd like to say to wrap it up?
Yeah, and please do join our Fastly Security Labs program. It's a beta program to get early access to features like this, especially for our API spec. Mismatch signal. It's easy to join our Fastly Security Labs program and get early access to this beta feature.
Fantastic. I'll be joining for sure. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you all soon for another edition of Fastly Developers Live. Have a great weekend.